Hello, friends. Welcome, everybody. This is Aristocracy, as many of you probably know, as everybody watching most likely knows. Eris, if you want to give a little bit of an introduction for yourself.
Um, I'm Eris. I normally try to do like historical and educational content. Um, and I took a break from streaming for a bit, but I think I'm coming back. I think that's it, really.
Very cool.
I need to work on my introductions again.
um, and that's actually the first thing I wanted to talk to you about, really, is like your status on Twitch as a history buff. Like, you
Mm.
seem to be one of the main people who is coming at content from that particular angle. Do you have a history of being interested in this? Do you have any degrees or anything, or is it just sort of a hobby?
I have always, I've always been like obsessed with just fantasy worlds, I guess. And I think like ever since I was a kid, and when I found out that some of those stories were based on real stories, that just like blew my mind. I remember seeing uh, going to like a game store as a kid, and I saw this. She looked like this beautiful princess in armor on a horse. Um, Fighting like just in front for a video game. I was like, who is this? Like this is like something out of a Disney movie. It was so cool. Um, and it turned out it was Joan of Arc. It was an Age of Empires game. And like I remember reading about that and I was like, this is insane that this happened. Why aren't people talking about this like more?
Yeah.
It's just I just love the stories. I'm a sucker for good stories, and the stories are just absolutely insane. Um, and so I think that that was the big thing that got me obsessed. And I've always been, I get interested in everything. Like I go down through random rabbit holes from something like a soap dishes, or to like space or science, like anything like that I get really obsessed with. But history
Mm.
always felt really unique because history literally is everything, right? It is like art and music and philosophy and military and all these things. It's just anything that's in the past. And so, um, yeah, I don't know. I've just
Yeah.
always absolutely loved it.
That's really cool. And the Joan of Arc story is absolutely adorable. Like, Joan of Arc was also a really big influence on me. Do you have any particular like strains of history, particular parts of history that are your favorite to study?
There's It's so hard, right? Because a lot of the times, like the things that I love the most are the things that are somewhat not as important to study because they've been studied so much already.
Mm.
Um, so like the stuff that I love the most, it's probably an influence of like media and all that stuff. And I was always raised in mostly Commonwealth countries, but I just loved English history, um, and especially like English medieval history, knights and um, and chivalry and all of that kind of stuff, and just like the fascinating wars and stuff that would happen. It was such a different world than our own, yet also weirdly similar. Um,
Yeah,
that was always my favorite.
it's kind of uncanny to hear about things like the War of the Roses and
Mhm.
other, really big periods of medieval history and sort of what I would label castle history, that era
Yeah.
of castles. It's weird to think about how much of our media that we regularly consume is influenced by it, yet it was a real thing.
Yeah, and also there's an entire field in history called medievalism, which is not even actual medieval history, but our interpretation of what the medieval period was like, which really starts in the Victorian period. Like the Victorian, you know how like right now everyone's obsessed with Y2K, and then in
Yeah.
like the 2010s people are obsessed with the 80s for a bit. In the Victorian period, people were obsessed with the medieval period. In fact, like a lot of people's image of what the medieval period is like is from the Victorians. So what we think chivalry is the Victorians really. That's like they're the ones that popularize it, and it's mostly all really incorrect. And you see that stuff a lot in like things shows like Game of Thrones and all of that kind of stuff. Like there's some
Hmm.
things that are similar, but it's mostly it's mostly just figments of Victorians' imaginations. of stuff, and you actually see that in Victorian architecture, like neo Gothic, where they're trying to recreate that kind of Gothic medieval architecture that a lot of people mistaken for being actual medieval buildings.
That's really interesting. I kind of had an inkling that they were, at least interested in uncovering medieval history, but for it to have
Mhm.
been a fad is kind of cute. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Like in Game of Thrones, in the books particularly, the women tend to get married off very, very young, like even like 13, 12 years old. In the medieval period, it's not the case. And a lot of people will read it and think, oh, like George R. Martin is just being super accurate because that's what the medieval period was like. People are getting married off at such young ages. No, like in reality, most women were getting married off around like 18, 19. Um,
Hmm.
so uh, so that's also like a weird misconception that gets spread around.
Yeah, I wonder where that came from. Like, I wonder if it was influenced by, I'm pretty sure Juliet in Romeo and Juliet is canonically like 13. I wonder if it was maybe influenced by weird young romances of that type.
It might be actually. It's so interesting you bring up Shakespeare because so Shakespeare did a ton of histories, like plays based on history, like Henry the Fifth and that, and Richard the Third, and so much of our image of what happened is actually based off of those plays. The same way so many people think they know what World War II is from watching movies about World War II.
Yeah.
Um, so very similar.
Dude, yes. And speaking of popular topics, like popular topics online as far as history goes must be at least a little bit frustrating as someone who is actually learned in the subject. Like I think of Roman history and the history of the West overall as something that people just have so many idealisms about. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like the fact that we didn't even know until the early 1900s that a lot of marble statues were actually colored, and I've seen interviews of people who have seen recolored statues and they call them things like gaudy and ridiculous, and it's like
Mhm.
that's the real history though.
Yeah, the ancient world was completely colored.
Hmm.
That's Yeah, I don't know like where, and you actually people get it from movies. I mean, I used to think this too. Like you watch movies even in the medieval period and like everyone's in like beiges and grays all the time. And very little color. And sure there were some colors that were challenging to produce. But or you weren't supposed to wear, but mostly like a lot of this world was incredibly colorful, especially the ancient world. That's why I don't know if you've ever played the Assassin's Creed games, but a few years ago they came out with Odyssey, which was based in ancient Greece. And it was the first time I think I've ever seen, because they actually worked with a lot of ancient historians to develop the game. And it was the first time I ever properly got to see ancient Greece as colorful as it really was. And that was
Hmm.
incredibly exciting.
And that was in an Assassin's Creed game.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm not a huge game buff. I usually tend to play things that are a little bit calming, like Animal Crossing or something like that, Harvest Moon.
That's, have you played the new Disney Animal Crossing? What was it called? Disney
There's a
Dreamlight?
Disney Animal Crossing. No, I haven't.
It's I got really addicted to it for a few weeks. Like it's really fun. It's called Disney Dreamlight Valley.
It's probably
And
really
it's actually for
cute.
adults.
Oh,
It's actually
cool.
for adults, not for kids. I thought initially it was for kids, but it's for adults who wish they were kids. So,
Yeah. Man, and do you ever get like into historical debates on what actually happened when it comes to these topics that you're interested in, like on Twitter or on your Twitch stream when you streamed? Like, do you ever get people who are just vehemently like, no, it was like this, you
yeah.
know?
I mean, that's initially what got me into the politics space. It wasn't that even someone that's really that interested in politics. I actually find like I'm very apolitical myself. I If history's taught me anything, is that like I feel like the public knows very little about the ins and outs of what's going on with their governments. So until like later on. Um, so I feel very strange, like caring too much about it, and just in general, like I I just get overwhelmed with it. So I'm not a huge political person, but I ended up being somewhat thrown into the political space um, because people were so often invoking history to suit their ideological ends. And that is something that really grates on me. Like, really, and especially because it affected the discipline of history for so long. Like, for so long, historians um, were there were always people who were trying to do genuine history, right? And but they were plagued by biases. But there was also like so-called historians that were really just throwing their ideology in and trying to use history as a way to push whatever propaganda they wanted to. And such a good example of this is when you look at like the West has always been consumed, like the West is obsessed with ancient Rome. They see ancient Rome as like the father of the West in general. And so debating why the Roman Empire fell has always been like the ultimate historical question in the West. And you can tell so much about the ideology that's really dominating the period by what they determine is the fall of Rome. So, for example, in like the 18th century, they consider that the fall of Rome was because of Christianity. And what's happening during the 18th century? It's like the Age of Enlightenment. They're creating like this narrative that religion and Christianity is something that keeps you away from science, and it's all about science and logic and rationale and all that kind of stuff. So they determine that it's Christianity that made Rome fall, and now we know that's just complete bollocks. Like that's not true whatsoever. And I mean the answers are often just very complicated and almost don't suit any ideological need like consistently, because humans are very complicated in general.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a multi-hundred year, huge spanning empire that fell in pieces. Like, there's not even probably going to be a streamlined reason why each piece fell.
Yeah, it's like a million puzzle pieces that tend to come into place. And you can say what has larger influences and all of that kind of stuff, but it's so hard. Like, just if you just go on, say, like the subreddit Ask Historians, and you try to ask a really simple question, you're gonna get like a 12 paragraph answer trying to answer that simple question. And it's not because historians are trying to be like, pretentious or overly careful. It's just because it is overwhelming how complicated it is. It's hard to answer a lot of those questions.
Absolutely. It's like, I mean, it's like going on Quora to try and answer something like
Yeah.
that. It's like you're asking for a real answer, we're going to give you a real answer. It's not going to be very digestible.
Yeah, exactly. And then like you're also trying to go through all these sources and everything, and the older you go, the harder it is to find those sources, and the newer you go, the harder it is to determine which source to trust more. So it's always a huge challenge, but that's part of the fun. You're like an investigator.
Yeah. Just as a side note, I'm pretty sure it was in Pompeii. It was in some sort of volcanic ruins. They found these scrolls that are probably, they're currently doing the tests on them, but they're probably together enough on the inside that we can actually read them by emitting laser lights into them and seeing what's written on the scroll. Do you ever see that kind of stuff and get like super excited?
Oh my God, their new discoveries are the coolest things. In the ancient world, it's happening a lot because when you have because archaeology is a scientific discipline. So as science progresses, you find out more and more about a lot of the period. And so it's like, that's incredibly exciting. There used to be this huge thing. There's always like debates and like the drama that you see on Twitch. It's like that doesn't even compare to the drama you see between historians when it comes to like just debating the cause of something or the right interpretation of a certain fact. I don't know if you know who Richard III is, but he was a somewhat of an infamous king during the War of the Roses, the second last king of the War of the Roses, the guy who lost, basically.
Oh,
And
really?
and a lot of villains have been somewhat inspired by him. Shakespeare wrote one of his most famous history plays is called Richard III, and it's based on him. And his image of Richard III is very villainous. He's like hunchback. He's got like multiple fingers, and he's evil, and he killed his his nephews. He's like that evil uncle that stole the throne. And for the longest time, that was like it was that image of Richard III was very pervasive, especially like the physical deformities. And the thing is that the history is written by the victors. It's not always true, but in this case, it was because the Tudors they did win, and the last Tudor, Elizabeth, was the queen during the time of Shakespeare. So he was always, whenever Shakespeare was writing, he was always trying to make her house, like her royal house, look good. It was all about like how do we make the histories lead to this ultimate great virgin queen coming to rule the day. And so that kind of propaganda was laced like throughout all of his histories. And so because of that, Richard III was made to look very villainous. And he was even villainous against his own house. He was just like a really nasty person. And it was very common in the medieval period to, especially the late medieval period, to show, because deformities were seen as not some, deformities were seen as like a thing that you could use to demonstrate how evil someone was. It was almost like they'd been kissed by the devil. It's like if they were evil on the inside, they must be evil on the outside, kind of back and forth. And so they thought that Richard III had all these deformities. And a lot of these deformities sound a little kind of crazy, right? Like, oh, they had 6 fingers and like they were like hunched back with like a horn in their back and like shit like that a lot of historians often dismiss. And so it became very fashionable in like the 20th century to look back and kind of re-examine Richard III. There even was this thing, societies, very like prestigious societies were created in England called like Richard III Society and all this kind of thing to try to reform his image. And because people thought like, oh, like it's just Tudor propaganda. But they found his body recently. I think it was like in 2012 or 2014. People have been searching for his burial grounds for a very long time. And normally, it's usually easy to find a king's burial grounds, but with his, because he got overthrown, he was like chucked in some random backyard or something. And
Yeah.
they found his body. And almost and it was the society that was trying to make him look good that found his body, right? And almost every physical description of his deformities were correct.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
yeah, from the medieval period. Like, it was like he had all this weird shit about him, right? And of course, we'll never know whether that meant he was also evil on the inside. But it was like one of those weird things that it was like so exciting to find out. Where, and of course, like all these societies just collapsed because they were so determined that he was gonna be completely innocent. Yeah, there's so many things like that just I love that shit when like new discoveries come out, and sometimes it's not even a new thing, just no one respected that historian, and now people are starting to think, maybe that's legit. It's all
Yeah.
very exciting.
Very interesting. And thinking about how deformities and physical ailments are portrayed in history, it is something that's associated with someone being evil or mischievous or something like that. And you look at it from a socio-political lens and you realize, oh, if you were born with a major physical deformity, you might have had to resort to being a criminal in order to make your way, or being a beggar
It
or
might be a
something like that.
self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. Like that
Exactly.
was just what you had to resort to. I mean, Richard III in a lot of ways, like he's a second son, which in the late medieval period is a very shitty thing to be, because you get basically nothing. And it's almost worse than being a woman. I almost would prefer to be a woman than a second son. It's really shitty. So he had to make his own way in the world. His older brother was, both of his older siblings were like considered way better than he was in general. And so he probably had to do some shitty things to make his way, and all of that. So who knows? But at the same time, it's like there's also a lot of people who had physical deformities. I'm using like the historical term for it. I know it's not the politically right term to use right now, but and a lot of those people obviously had some incredibly cool things about them and cool character traits. So, I don't know if it's necessarily actually related in science.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's hope not.
Um, probably not. when you are studying history, something that we talk about a lot on my channel is philosophy.
Mhm.
So when you are looking at history, how does that affect the philosophy that you hold in your life and that you hold to be societally sort of
That's such a
applicable?
good question. Holy shit. Okay. The I actually think philosophy is the best thing to study alongside with history, and I'm a little biased because that's what I did. So, like when I was doing my undergrad, I also minored in philosophy, and it
Mm,
worked so effectively together. Even though in a lot of ways they were teaching me opposite things. So in history, you're taught to be basically like a cultural relativist, um, not because it's not because it's correct, right? History is very not concerned with which philosophy is correct. Um, but it's just because cultural relativism is, they believe that that's what's going to make you a good historian. That's what's, you're going to be more likely to find truth that way and all that kind of stuff.
mm,
So, and then simultaneously, I'm being taught in my philosophy classes that moral realism is basically correct. And it's like, and it was like complete opposites, you know, because the big thing I was being taught in philosophy was you have every right to judge every person in history. It doesn't matter like by moral standards or anything. Like you can judge, and it doesn't, and it's not relative to a certain time period or a certain location or anything. Like if you believe that certain rights are important, that applies to everyone throughout history, throughout any continent, anything like that.
mm,
And that seemed to be very consistent. And that's a pretty, I would say that's the standard view in philosophy right now. There's some people who have different views, but that's like the majority. And in history, obviously, like historians can't do that.
mm.
That would be absolute. Can you imagine like a historian trying to write about, I don't know, like Henry VIII, according to like modern morals and like Twitter standards, you know,
Oh
like
yeah.
just absolutely that would be absolutely crazy.
It would be. I think that something in between the synthesis of the two is probably the most realistic. Which one
Hmm.
did do you sort of lean toward? Realism or relativism?
Philosophically, I definitely lead towards realism. I think I try to somewhat leave it at the door, but also be charitable. Um, I try to be like charitable with people in history and acknowledge that they still didn't have as much access to certain ideas and all that. So the same thing that I'm sure that we don't have certain access to some ideas that were good during that period as well.
Mm,
So I try to be like a little humble about it, but it can be a challenge. Like I always like I guess the rule of thumb that I try to live by is like, how did that person respond to criticism of their actions in their own day? What criticism did they hear of their own actions? What did the wider culture that they live in think about their actions? And that tends to be how I somewhat, I guess, judge those people. So, like someone like Christopher Columbus, who was, I know a lot of conservatives get upset when they hear this, but like Christopher Columbus was actually very hated, even by the most conservative people at the time. Like his actions were considered super immoral, even by the standards of the 15th and the 16th century.
mm,
Um, so, and so much so that people changed laws about it and everything. That like I think it's pretty. It's and the same thing with Hitler, right? Like everyone is
mm.
anti-Semitic in the 1940s, but Hitler took it to a unique level. And so I think like with people like that, you can um, it's easier for me to judge them negatively, I guess. But
Mm-hmm.
you always have to be somewhat humble about your ability to do that from this time, you know,
Absolutely.
2023.
Yeah. I have a sort of historical question. Do you find it to be largely true, the stereotype that kings and monarchs had only yes men, that they were susceptible to the folly of only having their own perspective? Or do you think that that's not really historically accurate?
It depends, right? Like it depends on the time period because I know everyone likes to think as kings and monarchy as the exact same thing, but that system of government was so pervasive that there's actually so many different types of monarchy
Mm,
throughout history. Like, I think when people really think of monarchy, they tend to think of the absolute monarchy that you see in France in like the 18th century before the revolution, which is like this person is the representative of God, basically above the Pope, basically above all the aristocrats, so much so that the aristocrats dress him every morning, right? Like, it's like the person is worshipped and what they say goes. And the majority of monarchy in history is actually not like that at all. There's much more of a balance of power and everything like that. So I would say that that definitely was the case, that someone, like Louis the 16th, probably really surrounded by yes men, because of the power dynamics there. And he created a system specifically to be surrounded by yes men, on purpose. But would I say that, King John of England was surrounded by yes men? Definitely not. I mean, they forced him to sign Magna Carta. So it depends, but there's also like, especially once you start moving to the late medieval period, kings um, start being better at consolidating their power, and not leaving up so much to the nobles and the aristocrats around them. That there definitely starts to be a much stronger like power dynamic, that they definitely get surrounded by more yes men. Like I would say Henry VIII was surrounded by a lot of yes men, especially the Renaissance period. Um, uh, Led to a lot of people valuing skills over blood, right? And that sounds really nice to us from our progressive ears. We're like, wow, that sounds great. But it actually also had a problem, because it meant that because the king, the newer princes, like Henry VIII, he would surround himself with new intellectuals, who didn't actually come from they didn't come from noble stock, so they didn't have their own lands and they didn't have a lot of their own wealth. All of their wealth was completely dependent on the love of the king. And that itself caused problems and meant that they were really yes men because they were just completely dependent on him.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense actually. And I sort of I've been a weeb since I was a little kid, and so I am interested now as an adult in maybe getting more into Chinese history and a lot of the rich history of the East. And I wonder how difficult it's going to be to really get a solid set of information on those time periods, because even in just finding, and maybe this is more of a modern problem, but even in finding like news stories from today about China and other Eastern areas,
Yeah.
there's obviously the huge language barrier, but also we have a big cultural barrier now.
I actually think when it comes to examining stuff now, you've got all the issues of the fact that everyone's trying to sell you propaganda one way or the other. And you're living in, I'm guessing you're American, right? So you're
Yeah.
living in a country that has, a diplomatic and economic interests that are completely opposed to China. So, and that makes sense that a lot of the news, but at the same time, you also don't want to just go completely on the other side like a tanky would,
Yeah.
and just completely defend their actions by just pushing their own propaganda. So that's also a challenge. I think one of the biggest things that really that people have a challenge with when they look at something like Chinese, or Japanese, or just Eastern history in general, is the philosophy. There's a very different way of thinking. And all you have to do is just look at something like the difference between checkers and chess. So in chess, you're taking that. It's such a good example of the different ways of how they think about family, duty, honor. You hear those things and they mean completely different things, or even just masculinity means very different things in both regions, right? I think so in chess, you basically you use these pieces to slowly overpower and dominate and conquer the king, right? In checkers, you try to almost surround your opponent, and take away all their other options, and it's much more of a web that you trap them in, and it's more circular and it's more based on the system around them. And so checkers is very individualistic. Chess is very individualistic. Checkers is more communal, and that's and in the West, people tend to be very individualistic, and it's not a coincidence that the concept of individual human rights and stuff was inspired by Western philosophy. And that's actually been a huge criticism against international human rights laws and all of that kind of stuff, because there's a lot of cultures that just don't connect to those ideals, and you could just and people will just be like, oh, like, so they don't believe in human rights. It's like, it's just a different way of thinking. They value things like harmony and like, oh, the harmony of the community. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very challenging to look at modern Chinese politics and not like from a Western perspective, like, or a Western philosophical perspective, because it's gonna seem like wild. Like, I don't get it. How are they communists, but they're also doing this and that? Like, it just. But if you look at it from a Chinese philosophy standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. Um, and I mean, just even if you look at the name China, it literally means the kingdom. You
Yeah.
know, the kingdom. That's how they tend to see the world and everything. So it's just a completely different perspective.
It is. I learned a few years ago about a concept it's a bit of a philosophical concept. I think it's mostly cultural, called filial piety. And it's
Hmm.
this responsibility that you have to your elders.
Hmm.
They sort of balance it out in different Eastern cultures by having specific celebrations of children, but everything is generally all about taking care of elders. And that's such a huge difference from the, like you said, individuality of the West.
Yeah, like in a lot of Eastern cultures, putting your elder, like your parents, in a nursing home would be the greatest shame. Like, even if you hated your parents, like even if like they were like abusive and psycho to you, like you just wouldn't want your neighbors to see you put them in a nursing home. It would just be very embarrassing. There's no embarrassment like that in the West. I would say it's almost the exact opposite, where people are embarrassed to live with their parents. People are embarrassed to have their parents live with them, and that's like, yeah, that can be very, very different. And but there's a lot of different, and just in general, China is actually more obsessed with philosophy than the West is. The West has been dominated by a few specific philosophies, particularly like Socratic kind of stuff. But in China, they like actually have like a battle. Instead of a battle of religions, they have battles of philosophy. And there's this term, I forget. I I forget exactly what it is, but like there's this term literally for the battles of like these schools of thought, like Taoism versus Confucianism, etc. Um, and that stuff, I find absolutely fascinating. Like Confucius really comes, he really starts dominating during a period. I think it was like very common for people to be Taoists at the time, and if I'm remembering correctly, and
Hmm.
he was kind of like, and instead of trying to convert people to a specific religion, he was trying to convert them to a way. He was trying to convert like the nobles and the kings to a certain way of thinking about duty and about responsibility as a leader. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that Confucius and idea just it still connects to today. Even the Communist Party of China tried to get rid of Confucianism for so long because they saw it as anti-progressive, and they actually eventually realized now, like now there's been this, the Communist Party has started to embrace Confucianism, and you have this weird um, combination of the two, which is like
Mm-hmm.
created what we see in modern China, which is super fascinating. But yeah, that Chinese philosophy is so exciting, and if you want to really like get a broader view of the universe and the world, it's such a good way to, yeah, to learn. Just like, I don't know, pick up any like introduction to Chinese philosophy book and stuff, because
Mm-hmm.
it's so fascinating, and it just makes you rethink everything that's around you, you know things that
Absolutely.
you take for granted.
I'm really influenced by things like the Tao Te Ching, and I have a couple of copies over here. I've been reading through the Bhagavad Gita, things like that, and that unionist perspective, this idea of connection in all things. It was actually originally a part of therapy. My therapist suggested Zen meditation just as a secular form of therapy for myself. And then I actually started to get into what these types of meditation techniques are based on, and it really changed my life. The idea of being present in the right now is
Mhm.
something that I think I think if you're not actually practicing it, I think if it's more of a cultural thing, you probably are tending toward more unionist web-like community perspectives. but
Hmm.
the internal spiritual message is so strong, especially for me compared to the idea of Christianity and other like separate god-based deity worship-based religions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the West is really influenced by the deity-based religions right now, but I think that's sort of changing.
Hmm. It definitely is changing. I think it's cool to see like the West like embracing a lot of ideas. That's one of the cool things about like just the new dominance of a lot of Asian aspects of culture, from anime to like Korean films and television and stuff. It's unfortunate that that hasn't worked as much for China, when in reality, most of these things that we love about those countries come from China. Um, but like a lot of things that people love about Japanese culture was really taken from China.
Mm,
But I feel like Chinese culture gets so often thrown under the bus. Um, but for very some good reasons, some bad reasons. But
yeah.
it's definitely unfortunate. I think like if my ancestry is not Chinese, but uh, I definitely feel like if I was a Chinese person, I'd be a little resentful of some of that.
Yeah, the cultural dominance of Japanese culture all over the world is definitely something um that not only pushes China out of it, but it further integrates us in the West into this sort of anti-Chinese
Hmm.
propaganda wave, you know?
Yeah, and especially when you see how the history of Japan with China, like the recent history, and that they still haven't taken responsibility for the things that they did, um, during the World War II. It's like I'm sure, from a Chinese perspective, the West looks like just complete hypocrites,
Mm,
um, with the way they criticize, the Nazis, but then still work very happily with, the Japanese. And when the emperor to this day goes and visits, like war criminals who tortured and raped Chinese women and stuff, like
mm,
every year, and bows to them. So, but there's still a lot of cool stuff about Japan. I don't want to say that I hate Japan. There's a
yeah.
lot of really cool stuff about Japanese history and everything. And it's nice to see like people finally starting to see things from like more of an Eastern perspective. There's a lot of stuff that is really wild when it comes to how progressive, I guess, some aspects of Asian culture were like a long time ago, especially like Central Asian culture with like Mongolians. Like when you think of like like I don't know, like a Mongolian Khans, like you don't really think of bastions of SJW progressivism. And they certainly weren't when it comes to like rape and murder and shit. but
Yeah.
um but when it comes to like tolerance, uh and um, and being and like just tolerating different religions and different cultures and respecting that, they were. That's so unique. Like there's very few cultures in history I could think of that were like that open minded. Like the Khans would often keep members of different religions all in his court just because, and they would like kind of convert from different groups. You even had groups convert into Judaism and stuff. Like it was like a super weird time where people were really experimenting with religions, and you just don't see that anywhere else in the world. And that also had to do with a very like, Eastern mindset, um, of of the world of philosophy and just like intellectual curiosity.
Hmm.
That only became as popular in the West much later.
Yeah, and I think that's reflected in the idea that Confucianism and Taoism are primarily philosophies. They're not
Mhm.
primarily religious. Whereas you
Mhm.
see in the West, people trying to absolutely convert people's deities, their entire religious foundation, in order to
Yeah.
surround them and make them an empire.
And it's actually super wild. Like when it comes to the West, like we see things in religions. So people will see something like Judaism and see Judaism as a religion. Like they'll ask you, like when I'm filling out a form, like what's your religion, and they expect you, if you're Jewish, to say that means that you're Jewish. And the same thing goes for like Taoism, Confucianism. Like if they're seen as religions, and they're often in the religious category. Even Buddhism. And in a lot of ways, that's such a flat way to describe them. You know, it's
Hmm.
their cultures and philosophies and ways of looking at the world,
Absolutely.
rather than like believing in a specific deity and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, if you're just joining us, my name is Johnny and this is Eris, and we're having an interview right now. Thank you all for being here. Um, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your history on Twitch and on Discord, just to sort of
Sure.
shift a little bit. From what I understand, and I wasn't a part of Calliopean Club before you started streaming, but from what I
Hmm.
understand, Calliopean Club was really your start. It's a Discord server.
Hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
So I always felt like when I was in university, that I learned more during like drunken nights at a pub or a party or in like a clubhouse on campus, than in the classroom. Like just having those spirited debates with other people that were interested in things you were interested in, and learning from the older students, learning from the younger students, and just the social environment. And when you were surrounded by people that were all trying to learn, it was like humans are social creatures at our core, even if we think we're introverts. And so it always inspired me to to better myself and to grow and all that kind of stuff. And it was just exciting. And so it made me sad that tons of people who don't have the privilege of being able to go to university or the opportunity, are like that opportunity is kind of stolen away from them, when it feels like it should be somewhat of a right for anyone who seeks it, to be in that kind of environment. And so I try to recreate it online, like I guess like a social, like somewhat like intellectual environment, where everyone was in trying to just learn together and all that stuff. And so you would end up having, there was a lot of debate in the community, but it was always like the debate was never focused on having to win. In fact, there was a rule in the server that you had to be charitable to your opponent.
Mm.
Um, and which is a very bad debate tactic. Like you should never be charitable. But you had to be in our server because the idea was that your opponent wasn't actually really an opponent. It was you were using debate as a tool, to learn together rather than to show off to an audience. Um, and so you were like teammates, kind of trying to find truth and improve yourself together. And it created, I think, like I was worried that it would create this really like snobby, pretentious environment, but it didn't. It created like an environment where anyone from any walk of life could just come and try to, improve themselves and learn more about the world, and all of that. And it was very, very cool. Like I'm still very proud of what happened there. But yeah, that's how I initially got started. And I also was debating. I debated a lot of Nazis during that time
Yeah,
too. Um,
absolutely. 2019 on Twitch was a time, girl. Like,
yeah. Yeah, like I didn't even know there was any of this on Twitch. It was mostly on Discord when I would like debate these people. That's how I initially first started just coming on Discord. I was like, I've heard of these Holocaust narratives. I want to meet them because I'd never met them before or anything, and just chat to them. And I started debating, and I was definitely a better debater then than I am now. But uh, yeah, it was a lot of fun, but it definitely got tiring after a bit. So that's why I ended up making Calliope Globe.
I would
I did
imagine.
not expect it to become as big as it did. I thought it would be like this small little, almost like this little lunch club, that would have like 60 to 70 people, and it ended up growing to like, I don't know, like 17,000 or something. It was crazy.
That's incredible. Do you still have a lot of like mods and friends from when you first started it?
Yeah, yeah. There's some people that I know literally from. I have some friends from that exact period. The unfortunate thing is that like running servers, like running a community, is really hard, and I'm sure you've probably faced this challenge with running your community too. It's so hard. You're often tasked with the idea like people get into conflicts and you have to pick who's correct, and often it's challenging and there's often not someone who's officially correct, and it's there's just like less bad or something, and sometimes you get it wrong. So there's also, yeah, there's definitely people that I've pissed off along the way, um, which is always kind of sad, but it
Yeah.
happens.
I've definitely experienced that as like the leader of the community and the content creator and the streamer. Like you have to be the example of what you want your
Hmm.
attitude in your community overall to be, and that can be so hard when you get frustrated, or when someone just will not lay off of a problem that you think you've already solved.
Yeah. And then you add to the mix the fact that like a ton of people who spend a lot of time online are dealing with a lot of mental health issues. Um, and when you spend a lot of time online, you're also, you have a tendency, the way humans work is like our brains start seeing that as real life. So it becomes much, everything feels much more serious than it really is. Um, and it's just, it's a recipe for a lot of disaster. So.
Absolutely. People get hurt feelings and they want to feel like they're part of a real community where people can really become friends. In Calliopean Club, did you, I'm sure that you put a lot of emphasis on that in your effort to keep people from actually debating each other to win.
Hmm. Yeah, it was always like trying to build the sense of community, which became more and more challenging as the server grew larger and larger. And then there's always like having to manage your mod team. The skill set that I needed in mods who were running a server like this, especially a server that was dedicated to like intellectualism, it's like everyone thought they were very smart. So imagine when you're a mod, like, and you have to debate someone on why they need to follow a rule, and you're debating someone who's like very smart themselves. It was a challenge, and I had to find those people, and I had to find people who were willing to not get paid, because it was definitely not a financially successful venture, and
Mm-hmm.
um, and dedicate and had a ton of time to it, and believed in it. It was always a challenge, um, and but when you found those people, it was really special.
Absolutely. My official producer, Brooksy10, shout out to Brooksy, came in to my stream and was absolutely immediately involved. He was like, "Let's get your Discord together." He had run a pretty
Hmm.
successful, very large mod team for a gaming server before. And so if I had
Hmm.
not found people like Brooksy and Lightwave at the time and people like that, I would not have been as successful as I am. Like, absolutely.
Hmm. And also just as the server became bigger, I started like, you ban someone because they don't follow the rules, and then they're like, well, we can just make our own server. So then you start getting like these like sprouting smaller servers that are trying to compete with you. And I'm incredibly competitive, so that would really bring up my competitive edge. And then you're trying to make sure that your mod team is loyal to you, and it starts almost becoming a little bit like Game of Thrones. um,
Mm-hmm.
it, and so it would get crazy at times. Um, and but Yeah, and I think like eventually I burnt myself out of running it, and it's one of the reasons why I passed it off for a while and moved to doing Twitch instead.
Oh, really? So that was your sort of movement. I was wondering if you were still really involved in Calliopean Club once you actually started on Twitch.
Yeah, I was barely involved. I passed off to someone that I trusted and respected a lot, and she ran it pretty effectively for a while. But then she had her own personal shit that she had to deal with,
Mm.
um, and then after that, it's so hard to find like, um, and I found someone who was also really great at running it, but they didn't have the same amount of time as we had had. So it's just slowly, it's mostly inactive now. I might kind of reignite it or something if I find like a good team to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but servers are like babies, you need to be constantly feeding them or they die. Um,
Yeah.
it's a lot of work.
Definitely. And like reigniting a dead server can be really hard. Like I've done that a couple of times with my server over the years,
Mhm.
and I know that it can be a real struggle to like keep mods active and things like that. So I definitely get you on that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But I'm still really proud of how it worked out, and like I've met so many of like so many insanely cool people. There's something that really happens that's really special when you're in an environment with people that you have something in common with that you like. There are so many people that like couples that met. And I used to joke that people would join Calliopean Club to find a girlfriend, and but it wasn't really a joke. Like people, people found uh, people found partners so much there and best friends and stuff. Um, and you know. it's and especially during the pandemic, it became really important when like the social experience in university was just cut completely.
Oh, absolutely. It's weird because like for a lot of people, the pandemic just completely slowed their progress, but then you get into the streamer verse and it's like, oh, everything exploded.
Hmm. Yeah. That's what I've heard.
Um,
Like I, the thing is, I think I joined Twitch politics when it was at somewhat of its height, so I just thought that was normal. I don't
oh
think I
wow.
realized. Yeah, like it was. I remember Prime K's at the time was getting like over 1,000 viewers, for a while. I remember it was like February a few years ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think like everyone's dropped a lot in viewership and all of that kind of stuff. Definitely a little different world because people are going outside, which is probably a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I started in 2018 and I saw the big explosion and everything and I'm just kind of like, I thought I was in Twitch politics for a minute and then I realized that's not the kind of content that I really want to make.
Hmm.
Have you found that sort of topic fluctuation? Have you found that that's affected you? Like people going from
Oh
being
my god, so much.
obsessed with the election to people wanting more like nuanced and actual takes on things.
For me, I was never too interested in American politics, so I don't think I ever really covered that. But I always wanted to talk about history and I wanted to examine things from historical perspectives. Like that, I will never get bored of, ever. Um, but it was so hard to resist getting involved in like the dramas and stuff that would happen. Like I've said it before, like that I don't know how you managed to avoid it. And whenever I would get involved, I would like justify it in my head. I was like, oh, well, I'm trying to correct the record, or I'm seeing something wrong happen. I need to use my platform to help this person, or something like that. But I'd always somewhat end up regretting it afterwards. And but it was a weird incentive system because I would almost double my viewership when I talked about those topics, and it was hard not to let that get to your head a bit, especially when I would get like punished for going to a more like, I don't know, intellectual topic or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you going through the phases of being in Twitch politics has been really interesting to watch. Like you consistently have a good perspective, but at the same time you've been sort of this like Twitch poll darling at different times.
Yeah.
And yeah. I'm sure that's been really cool. And you're the only VTuber in the space as far as I can tell as well. If you want to talk
I
about
think
some VTuber
there are a few
stuff.
others.
There are?
Yeah, I think there's oh my god, I forget their name. But yeah, there are a few others. But I definitely was I was probably like the one of the larger ones from what I remember.
Oh,
But
Doobie is a VTuber technically. Yeah, someone pointed that out.
mhm, yeah. But I don't think he's a streamer.
No, not
Like
really.
he ran the politics Discord.
Yeah. Were you ever in competition with the politics Discord? Did that ever like become spicy?
No, it was the opposite. We were actually sister servers. That's how
Oh, that's
I
cool.
That's actually it was Doobie was one of the people that pushed me to stream because we knew each other beforehand. Um, so yeah, so he was one of the people that pushed me, and we the politics Discord server worked really well with Calliope Club being sister servers at the time, because we didn't allow people to get really blood sportsy. We were very strict. We always said we were not a free speech server, and um, and so whenever people wanted to talk about certain things that were not allowed, for example, we one of the topics that was infamous that we banned was the is Muhammad a pedophile debate. So I was like, this is just not something that has any intellectual purpose. I just don't want it on my server. It causes too
Hmm.
much debate. And so when people would bring that up, I'd be like, okay, you can go talk about that in politics, like in the politics server. Um, and push them there. And if people complained about not enough rules on politics server, they could just be like, "Okay, come here." And we
Yeah.
served different purposes, so it was a good partnership for a while. Though they definitely made some decisions I disagreed with.
I see. Yeah. I did not know that about you guys being sister servers, but looking back, that makes a lot of sense actually.
Yeah.
With your VTuber status, again, I do think that that's part of your charm. You're obviously a very charming person anyway, but
Oh, thank you.
let's talk about like expression through your virtual image. Um, do you feel like you can be a little bit more free? Is it just a privacy thing? Like why do you do the VTuber thing?
I actually feel like it holds me back, and I resent it a lot. It almost feels like a disability, like an online
Hmm.
disability that like it's like something that I have to. I feel the need to have to do. Um, I'm a very expressive person in real life, and I often like feel frustrated that like I want people to see my expressions and to be able to communicate that way. I talk a lot with my hands, like I'm talking with my hands right now, and my VTuber avatar does not have hands. So,
Yeah.
uh, yes, you can't see that whatsoever. Um, I like it was much more that I felt like I had to do this. It was like, you know, um, it's just like when you feel like you have to be in a protective car in a scary area or something. Um,
Mm.
I think I don't know if I would have started this way if I had initially started on Twitch, but because I got my start in Discord, where everyone was already anonymous, um, and I had to be anonymous myself, just because that's the way everyone else was, and that was like and that's why Doobie's still anonymous. Like a lot of it's not a coincidence that a lot of people initially who got their start in the Discord world rather than Twitch, they're all using VTube avatars and stuff, um, because it's uh, yeah, because those were the rules basically in that world, and I made a ton of enemies, especially in the Nazi sphere there. That if they had my image, it would not be a fun day.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
yeah, especially I'm not like completely white European passing and stuff. So it's just it would not be fun. And I'm terrified of doxing and personal safety stuff. And yeah, so it's just it more so feels like this is just. I always told myself that if I ever got like rich enough or big enough on Twitch, that I could create some like a good security system, like Fortress or something, like a
Yeah.
then I would feel more comfortable showing my face, and I might end up doing it anyways. But it's just like the consequence. It's one of those things that once you do it, you can never take it back,
Hmm.
and so it just feels very scary.
That was the answer that I figured you would give. Not necessarily for the reasons that you gave. I found it, I didn't realize that you had as many people in the Nazi sphere, in the white power sphere, that were so against you. But
Yeah.
honestly, uh, you being a VTuber does make a lot of sense, and it probably did connect you more with your original Calliopean Club following to remain anonymous and to sort of be on
Mm.
their side in that way.
Yeah, and that's just like everyone is in that world. It's so normal. There are definitely some people that I've gotten to know that know what I look like, but that like I really trust. But whenever you do that, it's always like this weird anxious thing because it's like they also have this weird power over you that they can just throw in your face. I actually had someone that somehow found out what I look like, and they had a real picture of me and they blackmailed me. Um,
Wow.
yeah, like that happened a year and a half, like a bit ago.
Yeah.
So that wasn't fun.
No, I
So
would
it's like,
imagine not. Holy
yeah,
shit. Did
yeah. I
you
think that's
sort
the first
of
I've actually said about talked publicly about that. Yeah.
did you sort of pull back from the internet at that time?
Um, it was a mix of things, but that probably played a little bit into it. Even if I try to convince myself it didn't, probably in the
Hmm.
back of my mind a bit. But yeah, it's always not fun when people have that power over you, I guess. Um, or if like you fall out as friends or something, and you know that that person can just because one of the weird things about hiding your appearance is that any picture of you almost becomes like the blackmail equivalent of a nude, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's not really fun.
No, and I'm so sorry that happened to you, dude.
I it honestly is not even that bad compared to some of the shit that I've seen happen to other streamers. And people, there's an incentive system to not talk about it because no one wants to be like, "Woe is me," because everyone knows that we're like so lucky that we even get a following. so we sound like really cringe when we complain.
Mm.
Um, but the shit that I've seen happen to other people, there's like from blackmail and stuff, and people have to be quiet about it because you don't want to make that person. Um, you don't. I yeah, like honestly, like I'm just looking at my list. There's a ton of people that I know that have been like blackmailed and treated like absolute shit, and they just no one knows about it and stuff. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I feel like the need to treat people really kindly and with respect, even when they do things that baffle me, even when they do things that I'm like, what the fuck? Like that seems crazy, or I disagree with it or something. I try not to burn bridges as often as I can, because like you just so often I get to know the person later and I find out why they were acting that way. And there was so much more to the story. More often than not, people have turned out to be really kind and good people, even if they seemed more obnoxious on stream. Um, and like I'll give you an example, like I don't know if you've ever spoken to the ANCAPs, like Fabian, Liberty, Scott, and all of them.
Oh yeah.
But people make fun of them all the time because of ANCAP ideology. But
Yeah.
yeah, if you knew the shit that like he and people he knows like have gone through, it's like it would almost be crazy to not have this perspective. So it's once you learn, and there's just like ton, even like Chud Logic, like he's been doing things like lately that I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, or with like his editor, like I don't get it. But I also like the shit that he's had to deal with that he can't talk about to other people. It's like I almost, I don't know. It just gives you a lot of empathy for people in general. So I
Absolutely.
try as best as I can to treat people kindly. Though I've definitely failed, and whenever I do, I've regretted it, especially in such a public place.
Mm-hmm. I I appreciate that about you, by the way. Like, that's one of the reasons that I've kept up with you is
Oh,
because
thank you.
I have that perspective of, and I sort of come at it from the opposite way. I've never in my adult life been truly anonymous online. I certainly am not on
Mhm.
Twitch. You know, people know I live near New Orleans and things like that. Um, and I have this real, it's genuine. I do it in my real life too, but I have this real responsibility that I feel to be kind to people because I know not only do they probably need it, but whatever I do will reflect back on me and my actual visage in the most real way.
Yeah, and that's how humans have controlled their. We all have dark sides to ourselves, and we all have dark desires and stuff. It's like a natural thing, but it's been something that we evolved literally as social beings because we kept one another in check. It's actually like the current theory right now in like prehistory. I don't know the right term to use. That the reason why Homo sapiens defeated the Neanderthals, even though we were dumber than them, like the Neanderthals actually were smarter than us, but we defeated them because we were better at socializing and organizing. And particularly, we were very good at demonizing and demonstrating consequences for people and ostracizing people like in the social group that caused problems. So like through things like gossip. So gossip is often something that's really demonized today, but in reality, it's like one of those things that humans use to somewhat like control behavior and morality and stuff within a community. So someone stealing has someone you notice someone steals your bananas. You mention it to the guy next to you. It's like just he steals people's bananas, so don't ever give him an extra banana or something because he's going to take more. And that starts spreading. And then what do you know? Joe gets somewhat ostracized from the group and no one's having their bananas stolen. And the society has more bananas. So it's things like that like, I think that when and anonymity has just stolen that concept from humans. There's now very little culpability. Um, and I realize I'm being a complete hypocrite because my whole thing is being anonymous, but I feel like it's forced on me because the people that I'm constantly at odds with are anonymous themselves, and you're always at a disadvantage when one person's anonymous and the other person isn't, because one person's going to face consequences of their actions, the other isn't. And like some of the shit that I've seen, it's like one of the things I've agreed with Jordan Peterson on, that he was talking about on Twitter, that some like the harassment that you see that happens on Twitter and stuff, you would just never see humans. Like, it's the first time I've ever seen humans just operate at that level without any consequences to their actions, like to their morality.
Mhm.
And that's totally wild, and that scares me a little, like how normalized that is.
Oh wow. And the ability of people to be anonymous is so much smaller than they really realize. Like it's
Mhm.
very easy to get your IP address doxed. It's very easy for someone to find out exactly where you live or to get a picture of you or something if they have any idea where you live.
It's all about
Um
time dedication, right? So,
mm,
like, the more amount of time that someone has, the more, like, anyone can be doxxed if they have, um, and so, like, the goal, I guess, if you're trying to protect your online identity, like I am, is to try to just make it as annoying as possible, so that someone can dox me, but they're gonna have to dedicate a lot of fucking time to it, right?
mm,
And so you have to weigh that with, like, how much do they hate you, um, and how much extra time do they have. So you're always trying to make that ratio is very much in your favor. And some people, yeah, their ratio is definitely not in their favor. Like, they're
mm,
willing to make everyone hate them, but they make it very easy for themselves to be very doxxed, which is unfortunate.
mhm. Yeah, and this is fascinating because I, again, come from the opposite side of the internet world where everything that, like, it wouldn't be easy to dox exact things about me, but I've definitely experienced people like alluding to the idea that they might know where I live, and it's just like, yeah, everyone knows I live in Louisiana, you dumb fuck. Like it's a whole part of my shtick on here is that I'm the Southern pro-gun queer person. Like, you have to know things about me in order to get into this part of the stream and to really be a follower and stuff like that. And I think that your VTuber status is something that maybe elevates you in a way that it makes you a little bit untouchable as a public figure. Like, it doesn't feel like you're completely closed off, but it also feels like, oh, there's an air of mystique, you know?
It's interesting. I actually got it as huge criticism when I first came on the scene. IRI, I'm really important. Got
Mm.
initially, like, he initially said that he didn't trust VTubers. I was like, that sounds discriminatory and bigoted, right? But he had very logical reasons. He had very logical reasons for it. That he felt like he shows the face, so he's showing like an aspect of vulnerability, and he has to face the consequences of his actions and the words. And whereas I could just go and say whatever I wanted. And I remember hearing that and I was like, it somewhat baffled me because I'd worked so hard. Before I was Aristocracy, I was Eris. And so I've
Mm.
had the same online persona for like I don't know, 6 years or something that I've worked hard to cultivate and gain some respect off of. So I wouldn't, even though people didn't see my face, I wouldn't just throw it away. Like, I still try to be really careful with words and all that kind of stuff. But
Mm.
he's right that it doesn't always apply. And there's definitely maybe less consequences to something that I say versus someone who has like their full name. Like, you look at like what happened to Keffels, and she has like her whole name and on her Wikipedia page and everything like that, and had to move and run away and all of that kind of stuff. Like, and the shit that I've seen happen to Destiny too. Like, it's wild, and so I'm very grateful that I thankfully haven't had to face some of those, though there have been attempts. So
Yeah. Absolutely. And of course streamers and online personas, they can make a lot of money, but they don't have the same um protections and infinite amounts of money that like a Hollywood star would have, for instance. You know, even if someone
yeah.
knows a Hollywood star's exact address, they've got 10 acres of watchtowers before you actually get to their house, you know? I don't know any streamer that can afford that.
Yeah, and even if they can afford it, like even for the really big people, you would be surprised because it's such a new area of celebritydom. There's like, even if they wanted to hire a publicist, like there are very few like publicists and companies that are very good at managing this world because it's such a new thing. And you'd be surprised at how many huge streamers that I've spoken to have no team behind them. They have no help, and they have tons of money, but they have no clue what to do with it, right? Like they're just completely lost, and they Google things online, like, what to do in these situations, and it's so hard to know what's a scam, what's legit, who's trying to take advantage of you. And so they end up so often with like no help whatsoever. And that's just, and so it doesn't surprise me when I see them say things that you would never see a normal celebrity say, because like there's no one controlling their Instagram and shit like that to keep them from being dumb.
Oh, for sure. And, that's another big difference between here and the East is that in China, they already have huge PR teams and entire pieces of their economy that are dedicated to streaming and keeping streamers in line and things like that.
Yeah, they're way ahead of us, in negative ways and in positive ways. You could just see that in the differences between the TikTok for China versus the TikTok in the US. I read an article about that a while back, and it was like, wow, I can't even believe TikTok's legal here. Like if I was like if I was in the American government, I would have banned it so quickly. But freedom of expression is the American value.
I mean,
So,
true. And it's also a pretty good honeypot, to be honest.
yes.
Yeah.
It's a bit of an inconvenient value. In the age of like information wars and all of that kind of stuff, because it's just so easy to plant things in people's heads. The it's wild, the social media campaigns that I see happen, and everyone thinks like, like when your image of what propaganda is, you probably think of like um like the guy like saying like, I like, we need you, or we want you to join the US Army kind of thing. People's image of propaganda is very strawmanned, but in reality, like propaganda morphs and changes based on their audience, the same way advertising changes to advertise to millennials versus advertising to Gen Zers or anything like that. So propaganda does the exact same thing, and so propaganda now has a new look, and it's more like social media influencers and on TikTok and all of that kind of stuff. And the greatest way to look at that is to look at the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial that happened a few, like, I don't know, 6 months ago or something like that. That was an entire social media campaign that was run by the same or it was run actually by an organization. People thought it was like organic, but it was actually orchestrated. And this is not a conspiracy. You can look this up. It was run by an organization led by a specific lawyer that Johnny Depp had hired, who also consequently works for the Russian government, and had launched campaigns for Putin. And it's like really what they're, and it was like a very orchestrated thing, and everyone felt like it was so. It was like this culture war. Like, do you believe Amber? Do you believe? But it was really like a whole orchestrated campaign that someone paid for, and it looked so organic and stuff, and it was just all propaganda, completely.
That is intense. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I still watch TikTok though, because I can't resist it. I can't resist it. It's good at making me addicted.
It's very good at that, and I struggle with TikTok, because I spend a lot of my time my media time doing things specifically for stream, and with TikTok it's so hard to stay on the same grain of information. Like you can look up specific stuff, but one thing I do is whenever I get super interested in a particular topic, I'll follow specific influencers and go through their entire, I guess discography is not the right word, but I'll go through their entire like selection of media, just learning about one particular topic. One thing that I did that with is Chinese influencers. I follow a Chinese language tutor who also does updates on how social media is being run in China. And
Oh, that is so cool.
what's really interesting is how much of the restriction and how much of things getting banned actually doesn't come originally from the Chinese government necessarily or from the apps themselves. It really comes from the users. They're very conformist and they have a lot of opinions about like what child shows should be allowed, and
Mm-hmm.
Of course, really basic things like how somebody should look, what they should weigh, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that just goes towards the old Chinese philosophy thing that I was talking about. That like conformist is such a negative thing, and like it almost has a negative tone to it in the West. It does not have that in the East, and it's seen as somewhat honorable and selfless. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's like it's just totally different perspective on something like that. Even I think that's like it's one of the core disagreements between something like um, like what's happening in Hong Kong. And when people were debating, are you taking Hong Kong side or are you taking China side? But a lot of the Chinese, like, they see Hong Kong as being like um, a, a bastion of like Western like propaganda and Western morality being pushed on them. And I'm sure a lot of people in Hong Kong don't feel like that. But it's so hard to know like how people genuinely feel versus just propaganda, because you can convince someone of almost anything with the right, with the right uh, brainwashing like ability.
Mm-hmm.
Like even like I've been like no matter how educated you are, as long as you have access to the information the person's giving you, it can happen, which is scary, not fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, and even with her, like this woman, I think her name is Dr. Candice Lynn on
Mm-hmm.
Instagram, and she's very intelligent. I do trust the majority of the things she puts out, but sometimes I look at a piece of information or how she's analyzed a particular wave of social media in China, and I'll be like, okay, I'll take this with a grain of salt. I don't necessarily have a million and one different perspectives on this, but that's like the individual responsibility to have that perspective and to look for other perspectives if you need it. And not everybody has that. I think that literacy in that way, media and online literacy, is really lacking right now.
Yeah, and I don't even know. Everyone says that like the answer is just education, or the answer is, we need to stop misinformation being spread. But it's like, who gets to decide what that misinformation is? That causes an entire issue. And on top of that, even when you have good information, it's like I get an example I'll give is uh, during I think it's mostly over right now from what I know. I might be wrong. But during the issue with the Uyghurs in China, that was like a very big issue that people were talking about for a very long time. Um, and like I would say that the majority opinion that I saw in the West was that there was a genocide going on against the Uyghurs in China, perpetuated by China. That was something that like especially people who are knowledgeable on the topic definitely believed in. Uh, and then you'd have people like tankies being like, oh, like that's just Western propaganda, blah blah blah. Like it's
Mm,
just anti-Chinese sentiment. And in some ways, they were right that those rumors were being fostered and spread by uh, government officials, and the U.S. government was definitely because there have been genocides in plenty of other places that the government has tried very hard. There's a lot of wheeling dealing that happens with the media and stuff to try to hush certain things because it's just inconvenient. But this was convenient for like American politics. But at the end of the day, it's like, um, you know, it it might have actually been happening. There were reports of the low birth rates and all of that kind of things that were happening. And it's like, I remember when I first heard about it, I was like, this sounds, especially with how much this is getting spread compared to like other genocides where there was way more evidence for, like the Darfur genocide
mm,
in the mid 2000s. Like, why is this the one that's being spread so much and being so it's like there was a skeptical part of my brain being like, is this like just total bullshit and some like anti-Chinese propaganda that's being pushed by the Western government? But then you also think like it's totally possible that it's the opposite. And what if you're wrong? Like, what if I assumed that it was just propaganda and I'm wrong? And like, how it's kind of a big bet to take to
mm-hmm.
just assume, oh, it's just propaganda, when you literally might have an entire group that might get wiped out. And so it's like you have to investigate all that stuff. You have to take it seriously no matter what. Um, and I'm pretty sure it never fully was investigated. And now it's apparently over. I don't know. Like, but
Yeah.
it's just an example like that. It's so challenging to know, like, what is the right way, just as a normal individual civilian who's probably, I mean, I'm against genocide. I don't know if you are.
Yeah,
And and I'm for human dignity and all of those kinds of things. Like, how do you act, as a responsible citizen that's trying to advocate and against human cruelty, and but also be uh, aware of how much propaganda and how much like the information that you're being received is somewhat purposeful.
mm.
It's like, yeah, it's just I don't have the answers on how to handle
Yeah,
that, and I think that's probably why I end up being a lot apolitical as a consequence, because it's like it just feels, it's like the coward's way out. It just feels easier, but I don't
absolutely.
begrudge anyone for not taking the easier way out.
Well, as a streamer, do you feel a lot of pressure to talk about those things and to have an opinion anyway?
I did.
Mm.
Especially I got you get pigeonholed as a streamer, like into, just in general as a public figure, get pigeonholed into symbolizing something rather than like a complex human being who makes mistakes and has likes and dislikes and all of that kind of stuff. So I got pigeonholed into being Jewish, and
Oh.
for some reason being pro-Israel when I don't consider myself pro-Israel. I got like pigeonholed into that perspective. And so people would always, to this day, people come to me. I have streamers who like will message me, be like, "Hey, I'm dating a Jewish girl. I need some advice."
Oh.
Like I'm like that's the category I'm in their heads. And so I definitely would feel pressure, like whenever someone was like, "Oh, what's your opinion on the current Israeli government?" It's like, to be honest, I don't know. I
Yeah.
had an Israeli government in 1948. Not the current one. But yeah, you definitely feel somewhat like pressure to have opinions on everything.
Oh, definitely. The current one is the Ukraine issue, and I try to
Yep.
take it as seriously as possible while also making it abundantly clear that I am not in the situation. I'm not over there. I can't really have a solid opinion without having direct experience on something like that.
The Ukrainian situation is such a weird thing for me too, because I believe so intensely into like in international law and the sovereignty of nations. It's like a very strong belief to me. So like Russia invading Ukraine is such a clear violation of a lot of my morality. But at the same time, um, I also grew up um, with so much, with so many stories about the way Ukrainians acted during the Holocaust, uh, and and to this day, you go to like a Ukrainian, you go to like a, I don't know, like a here, like just here in Ontario, there's a few like Ukrainian cemeteries, and they have statues just dedicated to specific like SS soldiers that were Ukrainian and stuff, like to this day. And someone once vandalized it, and it was considered a hate crime against Ukrainians when they like
Mm.
vandalized like a statue of a Nazi. Um, and so like, and then I hear like a lot of people like I don't know, liberal Westerners who are saying, oh, like everything that Putin is claiming about the like Ukrainians having a Nazi problem is bullshit, and maybe it is. I don't know. It's a very complicated situation, but it's hard not to let a lot of like old bigotry that I was somewhat raised with against certain Eastern European countries like impact your perspective, you know. So I've
That's very
somewhat stayed out of that.
Yeah. I I think it's very interesting, the Canadian perspective in particular, because you guys seem to have more of a cultural exchange with Europe than Americans do overall.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're actually, people think we're more American than anything, but in reality, it's all shallow. Like, in a shallow way, we look like America, but the culture and the soul of Canada, like, and the moral underpinning of it, is very British, and it's much more British than anything else.
Mm.
Our system of government is still British. We still literally say the crown versus I don't know, whoever's getting charged with something, not the people. Um,
Yeah.
our system is still officially a monarchy and everything like that. So it's very, very different in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. You uh, at one point for me, you were sort of pigeonholed into the monarchist on Twitch. Do you still agree with that assessment?
I like being pigeonholed there, because it lowers people's expectations enough about me that like then I feel like I'm less likely to get canceled, because just if I say things like I believe in human rights, I impress leftists, you know.
Hmm.
So it's you. I find that leftists end up treating other leftists way worse than they treat anyone else. Because like I don't know if you've seen the way Loner Box has gotten treated
Hmm.
lately, but he's like super far left. Yeah, he gets treated like crazy terribly by a lot of them. Um, and I don't know, there's just so much infighting that like it's just so much easier to just be like, say you have some wild ideology or people think it's wild, um, and and then everyone's just going to be impressed by you no matter what. You know?
Yeah.
But I do like monarchy as a system. I don't know if I have logical reasons for doing that. Right? It might just be like I'm a nerd and I'm like really just obsessed with a lot of the characters and stuff and the aesthetics that I love in history. And maybe I've just like convinced myself of the logic of it because it's just I wanted to. Um, but I definitely like some aspects of it for sure. So
Yeah.
I like the English monarchy. Like I wouldn't choose to get rid of it, even though most
Mm.
people probably would.
Yeah, I had a whole panel probably about a year and a half ago, maybe almost 2 years ago now. And it was on the monarchy. It was around the time maybe when Harry and Meghan got married, if that timeline
Hmm.
lines up. Um, and Brooksy, who I mentioned before, is actually from the UK, and he had a lot of similar emotional attachments. And sort of by the end of the panel and by the end of a few more discussions, he was just sort of like, yeah, I can't really justify the monarchy in a way that makes fiscal or legislative sense, but I can justify it in that it gives us a lot of comfort, essentially.
The I feel like I could justify it those ways. I think that there are good arguments against those justifications, though. The
Mm-hmm.
um, there is something that it's very. I think people often see them as celebrities, um, when that's somewhat of a incorrect view of it. And then there's also a lot of philosophical differences between like the royal family versus the monarchy, and they're often at odds with one another. Very famously, right now with the current, I guess, conflict between Prince Harry and his family and the institution. Um, I think for a lot of people, like the monarchy is the living symbol of the nation, the same way like the flag, is the living symbol of the nation to an American, right? Like you have like these
Mm-hmm.
things that are just like symbols and stuff, and you don't really have them represented in people, but in England they are, and so the idea and a coronation is going to happen soon, I think in
Mm.
May. When King Charles gets coronated, and I encourage everyone to watch it, even if you completely hate the monarchy, because it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to watch a modern coronation of a monarch.
Mm-hmm.
It's like an institution that has lasted for so long, um, and you will notice that it's very religious. And I think he's going to probably try to make it not as religious. And um,
Oh.
oh, hi Sonia. Um,
Yeah.
and he'll probably try to make it a little less religious, but they can't escape. There is an element of spirituality and mystique, especially when they crown him, like officially and everything like that. Because the idea is when the crown goes on his head, he is no longer um, Charles, right? He's no longer this individual. He is now like the symbol of the nation. He is the crown. And he's no longer an individual with human rights. He doesn't have the ability to vote. A lot of people don't know that. The monarch can't vote. Like they don't. They actually have way less rights than like a normal person, and more duties. But then they also have some nice benefits, living in a palace, things like that. A good
Yeah.
security team, which I'm very jealous of. Um, and so it's like they cease being human. And you've seen this is a very common thing with monarchs forever, even in elected monarchies. Like Rome actually used to have an elected monarchy, and it was like a very similar thing, like that the monarch becomes somewhat of like this mystique figure. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was seen as like a god. And that there's a lot of power in that kind of imagery and what that means, especially and I think you really see the effects of nations that don't have that, like in the United States, where because you don't have a person, rather than you just have these individual like objects that symbolize, like from like a flag to a constitution or something like that, or a gun. I guess guns
Yeah.
seem to really unite Americans too.
Yeah.
The Because of all of that stuff, you don't have someone that's like officially making sure everything is operating in a non-political, divisive way. You end up with situations like January 6th, which are, I can't even imagine happening in a modern day Britain, where like people are literally worried, like how, because everyone's partisan. Everyone's partisan. There's no one that's actually going to unite all Americans together. So they're like, everyone's so obsessed with how January 6th was so unethical, revolt against the government. They never think, imagine what it was like, probably from the perspective of people who supported it. They literally thought that their elections were being stolen.
Yeah.
Like they thought that, even though there's obviously very little evidence for that. And the fact that they genuinely didn't trust a system, and there was such distrust in like that voting system that they literally thought that the election was a fraud. That's really bad. Like that's really bad. And the United States needs to figure out a solution for that. And the United States is a baby country, and people like have this idea that it's this, like a long-standing country. It's really in its infancy. You compare it to something like England that basically was created like over 1,000 years ago. Actually, you could say even way longer than that. It's the United States is like a total baby, and it's one of the only nations I could think of that was founded literally on a philosophy, rather than an ethnic group or like any kind of like national history like that. So it's very unique and it's very special. Like I would be very proud to be an American as well, but at the same time, it's in that baby stage that it's like there's so many things that you guys still need to like figure out and hone out and polish. To figure out like how do you get that philosophy and how do you make it consistent, and work in a way. And I think one of the things that's really missing right now is that sense of like who's making sure, like in most countries with presidents, the president is somewhat of a non-political figure. They're like elected for a longer period of time, and they're not a member of a certain political party, and they're the ones that make sure that the elections are run fairly and all of that kind of stuff, and they unite everyone. You don't have that in the U.S. Like, who do you have that unites everyone? Like the Kardashians? I don't, I don't know.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's like that, and so that's a problem that I think Americans will need to figure out, and hone out. But I'm sure they will.
At some point, I
Hopefully.
think it will happen, but at the same time, like I used to tout myself when I first got in the political space as an American patriot, essentially. And
Mhm.
through really genuinely reflecting on that and being asked 1,000 times by people like what actually unites America, other than this very vague philosophical idea that's just inherently subjective of freedom, we don't have something like that.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, and on top of that, a lot of the values in that philosophy are somewhat like self-failing. So there seems to be like it's literally called the United States. So there's an like just by the name, there's like this kind of given idea that there are it's a country made up of individual states, and like states, like I mean Israel is called a state and it's its own country. So that's like, and that leads to things like the current abortion debate and all that kind of stuff, where people are like, oh, like we leave it up to states' rights and all this stuff. But what happens when you have states that they still need to be united in a modern country? And how much do you like completely leave up to those states? And I don't know how, I actually don't really understand the longevity of a country that can be that separate, like that, like have such different states,
Hmm.
and have like such different rules and rights and stuff, based in each of those locations. That it's wild to me. But at the same time, if you would have told me, oh, in the late 18th century, a colony of Britain is going to revolt under the idea of the philosophy of John Locke, and like I would have told you that was insane. Like that's crazy. I would have never believed you. And that they literally founded a country based on a philosophy. Like that's insane. So it's kind of crazy that America ever got created in the first place, and that it became a world superpower. That's
Mm-hmm.
even more insane.
Absolutely. I have a clarifying question from Admiral, and then if you don't mind, I'll use this as an opportunity to kind of open the floor for chat questions.
Mhm.
Admiral says when she says monarchy, though, does Eris also mean feudal social structures? Is that something you advocate for?
It's not something that I personally like, though I do see why it's useful in certain periods of time. Like there's a feudalism was a good system for a certain time. Um, but somewhat an inconvenient system if you weren't at the top.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, so is capitalism. People
Yeah.
just have this idea of like social mobility and stuff. I guess that isn't actually as true as people think it is. But I still probably prefer it compared to the feudalism. In terms of, um, I just think there's so many different types of monarchies. Like, people are always shocked when I say that a monarchy can be elected. Like, a lot of monarchies were elected. The Romans had an elected monarchy, etc. The Buddhists had an elected monarchy. Um, so uh, that like there's so many different types of it that especially, and I love the aesthetics of it. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
love the aesthetics. I love I just think it's absolutely beautiful. It's not to me it's not a coincidence that the most beautiful Christian religion, there are so many different Christian religions, I might piss off some people, is the one that operated with a very monarchy like system, which is Catholicism. you know
Hmm.
so
We have a question from Alley Cat. Hey, Alley Cat. Would you make a comparison like this from the USA to something like the EU regarding our previous discussion?
which comparison
I think
do you think
the
you're saying?
uniting of states together.
Oh, yeah. Um, yeah, like I think there's this idea within international relations, um, that the concept of nations, like that nations themselves are always going to be at war, no matter what, even if they're run by the most ethical people. That like nationalism as a system that operates human and controls human culture, right? Is like war is required for that to work, because even if it's like, again, even if you literally had like, Gandhi's a bad example now, but I don't know, like literally the Buddha
Yeah.
himself leading a nation, right? That nations have to be at war constantly. It's like impossible not to. And the reason is that the number one role of a nation state is to exist. Like that's its number one goal. It's to continue to exist no matter
Mm-hmm.
what. And the number one thing that starts impacting, like, so anyone who plays like any video game related to this knows it's true that if you're not if you're not expanding, someone else is expanding, and they're probably going to expand into you. And so anyone else becoming stronger is a threat to you just naturally. So you have to become stronger. And so you can become stronger by building up your economy and all of that kind of stuff. But even that is going to be somewhat in a conquest way, as we saw in like colonialism and stuff, where people got, where people would steal other countries' resources and all that kind of stuff. So, like, nations in general are just always naturally going to be at war. They have to for the sake of their existence, even if they don't want to. And so, the idea is that, like, the only way that you could stop this infinite war, right, which it culminated most famously in World War II, is actually, I would say World War One, because that's when the League of Nations really got created afterwards. Because people think World War One was like this big war and one of the only big European wars. It wasn't. It was actually the culmination of like a ton of European wars that had really started with the Napoleonic Wars in the 19th century. So people have just been constantly at war, and they're like, this is insane. Like, how can we continue to live like this? And the answer was to try to create some kind of like an international body that guaranteed certain countries' existence. And so this is one of the reasons why Russia invading Ukraine was such like a big deal, and the fact that everyone just let it happen because everyone's afraid of nuclear war. Probably good reason. It's very dangerous. It's almost as dangerous as nuclear war itself, because if they didn't, because now that Russia knows it can just invade countries. Well, I guess in a way they didn't really, because they started funding them military-wise and stuff. I don't know too much about the war, but the issue is if you just let it happen, you're basically going back to that old game where countries are going to force, like Russia is feeling forced to expand because it's afraid of the United States, right? The United States is going to be forced to expand because it's afraid of Russia, and then China is going to be concerned about it, and then like everyone starts playing this game, no one wins, and that's just a super toxic system. And so the solution is these international bodies that guarantee countries like sovereignty in their existence. And that's very challenging, right? Like the League of Nations failed. The United Nations was somewhat successful, but is very corrupt and has like a lot of problems because it's very, very hard and all that stuff. But I guess like the eventual goal is that like you'll create those systems and those systems will become so ingrained and so used to that eventually you do have like a united Europe, right? Or a united North America. And the same way all these individual states, or the same way like France, like you had like Burgundy, Aquitaine, and France all come together for a united France. And now we see it as one united country. That the same thing will happen there. And I think the EU people were hoping that the EU would be the exact same. And but it's very challenging, right? Especially when you have countries with very different incentives and geography that has different needs and all of that kind of stuff, and causes a lot of problems. And I almost feel like today we're further away from that world government that a lot of international relations people wanted. We're further away from it than we were like 20 years ago.
And I
I don't
think
know if that answers that question.
I think it does, but I think an interesting observation is that, in my experience, a lot of modern Americans, we don't associate America as it is now with expansion.
Mm,
Not necessarily by joining territories. Like we can't even manage to make Puerto Rico a state, you know.
mm-hmm.
But capitalism is our expansion. It's this ability to have money in every nation in the world and to have industry in every nation in the world, and for it all to flow back to the United States, you know?
There are some historians and political analysts that consider the United States still an expansionist empire. It's definitely much more of a lefty take, for sure. And the most famous historian that perpetuated this idea was Howard Zinn. And yeah, if someone's interested in that idea, they can go read up on it. And controversial in the history community, though he's an excellent writer. And his idea was that the United States is an expansionist empire, and he made some solid arguments on why that's the case, especially when it came to like installing, having, I guess, like moral reasons to invade countries, and then installing what he would call like puppet leaders in their place, but who were really being controlled by the United States. Like a lot of people think that the United States helps Israel because I don't know, like they're just trying to help Jews out or something. I don't know,
Yeah,
but they're
Jewish
helping it
Christian
because
kinship.
it's an American, diplomatic interest to have, to have basically like an embassy in the Middle East and a military power there that they have a lot of control over, and that control's been waning slowly over time. But so there's a lot of arguments that say that the American is that there is an American empire, and there are some like literal examples of that, with Puerto Rico and and Hawaii and a lot of countries like that. So a lot of states like that. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a complicated question, though. A lot of those people will use it as a way to argue, because what happens to empires? All empires fall. I don't think any empire has ever survived indefinitely. And so the argument is usually used to demonstrate that the American empire is going to fall the way, Rome did, or the British Empire fell, etc.
And that leads into, it looks like we have a couple more questions. That leads into Harstar's question. What, in your opinion, is a major, how did they put it? A major turning point in history where if one side had won, the other human history may have been very different. I think that World War I and II are a pretty good example, but do you have any
Oh
other
my
examples?
God, that's such an intense question. it's such a good question, but holy shit, I don't know. Like, I feel like any answer I would come up with now is going to be really lame, because it's like such an intense thing. I mean, the obvious answer for me as a Jewish person would be World War II, that I wouldn't exist.
Hmm.
So, and um, but there's a lot of wars that I guess like a lot of people don't see as impactful that really were. Um, the you know, I mean, you can just look at what if the Moors had dominated Spain and Queen Isabella and Aragon and Ferdinand of Aragon hadn't won Spain, famously in the 50s, and launched the Inquisition. Would the world be as Christian as as it is today? The world is very Christian, incredibly. It's like the very dominant, and so easily it could have been Islam. Um, so that's super fascinating. Like, what would our world look like with that? I mean, just like what would have happened during the period when Jesus was crucified. There was, you know how like there's like trends in, like there you have trends on TikTok to wear Birkenstocks or something like that. There was a trend in in during that period in ancient Rome to be prophets. Like it was like a thing, it was the way to get girls. A lot of people, it was maybe a way to deal with mental illness. I don't know. Like there are a lot of people who are claiming to be prophets, especially within Jewish culture. There was like a Jewish subculture within Rome, to claim that you were the Messiah, or for people to think you were the Messiah. So the Romans were crucifying prophets like every other week. It was like very common. And why was it this one person named Jesus that ended up being the famous one, the very successful, and the one that people actually followed? Because there were tons of Jewish cults. That's what they were called by the Romans. Why was it him? Why was it his philosophy? Why were it his ideas? And it's so easily could have been someone else. And like, and his ideas are wild. Like we take a lot of that for granted, but like this idea that like you should love your neighbor, even if they're assholes. That's a totally crazy idea, especially for the time period. And it leads to a system of international law that we take for granted today. People usually think of chivalry when you say, when people say things like, "Oh, is chivalry dead?" Like all of that kind of stuff. I'm like, no, like chivalry is actually alive today in the Geneva Conventions. But people think of chivalry as like men opening doors for women and stuff. It's not. It's like it's the rules of war. It's the rules of combat. It's like the laws of how you conduct yourself with people, and those were completely inspired by Christianity and Christian morality and all that kind of stuff. And like, so it's like so many things happened as a consequence of those rules that it's like, what if I don't know, if another prophet who had perpetuated another idea had been invited, like what would the world look like? So I don't know. And that's not
Yeah.
technically a war, so it's not really answering the question. But there's so many things like that. Henry VIII famously was the one, he created basically the Anglican system that the majority of the United States and in Canada and the UK like follow, and split off from the Church of England, weakening the Catholic Church very famously. There's like, and he wasn't supposed to be king. He was a second son. He had an older brother named Arthur, who was supposed to be the second coming of the King Arthur legend, and he died when he was like 15, 16, I think, to consumption or something, tuberculosis. It's like, what if he had become king? How different would the world look? There's so many wild things like that. What if Hitler had, not failed his art class? You never
Yeah.
know.
Absolutely. And I've been falling down sort of a rabbit hole of Gnosticism recently, like studying Gnosticism, and they talk a lot about the Gnostics. They talk a lot about the different cults of
Yeah.
Jewish leaders who were supposedly the Messiah, and the hundreds of years following the actual life of Jesus where people were actively still fighting to make one person the true Messiah. I think that's a really good answer, actually. We have one from Merciful Dionysus, and we couldn't totally avoid the more social aspects of this, so we're getting a little bit back into Twitch poll.
Cool.
Merciful
Good.
Dionysus says Eris has an incredible talent to befriend and see the positives in a lot of people. Destiny, Demon Mama, Keppels, FLS, and others. On top of discussing views with a lot of people all over the spectrum of ideas, what is your advice for befriending people of different ideologies? Should you do it? Are there any positives and negatives?
So I think you should never befriend people with very different values than you. Like that I completely agree with a lot of lefties on and stuff. The thing is that like how someone comes, I don't think politics always equals values. I think so often politics reflects, it's a different equation. It's like values plus information equals politics. And that information or like information and experiences is so variable. Like it's so variant like that. There are so many people I know who have my exact same core values, but they come to such different political conclusions than I do. Like whether that means they're a communist, a libertarian, a liberal, I don't know, anything like that. And it's because they have different information than me. We're all like, and it would be very hubris of me to just assume that my information is like 100% the correct one, and always is. So I just assume that when I have different politics than my friends or a different perspective, and I still consider them good people, that it's just because we have different information. If we had all the same information, the same experiences, we probably would have come to the same conclusions. I try not to surround myself with people that have different values, and you'd be surprised at how many people I feel like do share a lot of similar values that are completely across the political aisle. And so it's like it's easy to just throw these terms on people, and consider them bigoted or something, and just pigeonhole them into some kind of category. But I think just looking at someone with empathy and a little bit of humility for yourself can really help build some of those bridges. And it's very rare that I've regretted trusting someone, and or giving someone or being charitable to someone, but I've regretted a lot when the times I've been mean or cruel or assumed about things about someone, and because so often people are much more complicated than they let on. So I guess that would be my advice.
I like that. Yeah. This is possibly related. I don't know. And feel free if I don't know what this is, but feel free to answer or not answer if you want.
Sure.
Hyper would like to know some things about the war room chat.
Okay. Sure. What does he want to know about the war?
I don't know. He
means
just says
Colorado
ask
war
about the
room?
war room chat. I'm not sure what that is. Just go ahead and tell me what it is.
Okay, so I'm guessing this is from so long ago. I can't believe he's bringing this up. So Prime Kai's had developed somewhat of a reputation amongst his mods and people around him of being like, I don't know if sex pest is the right word, but like creepy girls. And a lot of this, no one was coming forward as like a so-called. It was all like just rumors, hearsay, things like that. And no one was coming forward even behind the scenes. But then one person came forward, which was Katarana, and a lot of people knew about it before it became public. And eventually becomes public. She gets the support of her then boyfriend, Dylan Burns, for her claims against him. And at the time, I was very good friends with Doobie. And Doobie believed that Prime was completely innocent. And my experiences with Prime were mostly positive. So I had no reason. At the end of the day, I didn't know one way or the other. But I don't know. Like I remember that there's a lot of like wheeling and dealing, I guess, behind the scenes on what was going to become public. And so some people were taking Prime side, some people were taking Katarana's side. So there was like, I guess, like a war room that was created that was leaked to battle the accusations against him by Katarana.
Very, very interesting. Okay, well, that's definitely
Very
something.
interesting. Random drama like years ago.
Random drama from years ago. Well, Hyper is the keeper of the Twitch poll lore, so
Okay.
I'm not surprised that he knew something about that. Someone said, "Why do you think that nuking Florida is a good idea? Do you think we should nuke Florida?"
I can't I can't answer that question and follow the terms of service
Oh
on Twitch.
God.
So I'm gonna avoid
Okay.
that one.
Okay, cool, cool. Oh, I did have another like question about your VTuber model actually. I was thinking about it while you were talking because you said that you talk a lot with your hands IRL.
Hmm.
And I've looked into making a VTuber model. I actually have one done, but
Yeah.
I'm waiting until I get a hand sensor because I really want to have hands.
Yeah.
Um,
Gets hands. I'd love to improve my avatar to do that.
that was what I
So
was wondering is do you ever like think about changing up your avatar? What kind of
all the
inspired
time. I was
you?
actually planning on doing it last year, and I was trying to find an artist and everything. And I had this idea. I wanted to create, because the thing is, I'm not an anime fan, even though I am anime. So I wanted to make an avatar that didn't look like anime. And that was very hard to find. So I wanted
Yeah.
I wanted kind of like a unique, maybe like a darker art style. Um, and it was very hard to find an artist that could do that. So I ended up just giving up on the attempt.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other VTuber personalities that you have been inspired by or that you like to follow?
No,
No.
I didn't even know VTubing was a thing. I just heard that I actually didn't when people are calling me a VTuber, I was like, I didn't know what that was. I just I just thought I was using an avatar to track my movements and stuff. So
Cool.
I had no idea about any of it. I've actually almost never watched anime either. So I didn't even realize there's like a whole world um of us.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not surprised that it was really difficult to find someone who could make a VTube avatar who wouldn't be drawing it in an anime
Yeah.
style.
Yeah. It was everyone was like, "What?" Like, no, that's not possible.
Absolutely, yeah. Like when you hit a main art style, it's kind of hard to deviate, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Or some people would say that they were good at it, but I don't know, you could just tell that their main thing was this. So
Yeah.
I actually, people are always like, "Oh, how did you decide to design your VTube avatar?" So you know what I did? I just sent a picture of myself to the artist, and I was like, "Make me virtual." And that's exactly what they
Cool.
did. That's why I look so boring. So, like, literally, that's exactly what it, like, down to the jewelry.
I had a
So
feeling that that was what you did. You know, I was kind of gonna ask if your avatar looks like you. Yeah.
exactly, like the hair, everything. Though I think the under my neck, the hair has in real life has a little more body. It's
Mm-hmm.
very plain. It's like a plain color in my avatar. So I think that's the major difference. You know, and my eyes are definitely bigger as my avatar.
Oh yeah,
They're not as big, unfortunately, in real life.
for sure. And like rigging and everything, like it kind of
Hmm.
requires it to be a little bit cartoony, you know.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I expected it to be like cartoony and stuff, and I'm still really happy with how it panned out. Like the girl who did my avatar is just great and did it for a great price too. Like I'm very happy with it, but I'm not an anime fan, so I almost feel like a massive fraud whenever I'm walking around.
Walking
Yeah.
around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Oleg has a question. So Oleg is culturally Jewish and asks, how familiar are you with Jewish law? Have you studied the Torah, and would you define yourself in any way traditional? Saying hello from Israel.
Oh, hello. Uh, so I would say I was raised very Jewish in a traditional way. I actually was briefly Orthodox. So my Jewish education, it was very extensive up until high school. So I have a
Mm.
very like extensive Jewish like education up until that point. After that, it it becomes much more lame. But I definitely would say I know like 99% more than the average person. But like any rabbi would be able to destroy me in a debate over lore, over like the Torah or something.
Yeah.
Um, but would I consider myself traditional? I like that's such a weird. I don't believe in it like like uh spiritually. Like I
Mm.
don't think I don't know. I wouldn't say like I don't necessarily believe a God exists or anything. Like I often still pray just instinctively. Um, but I definitely don't believe that if I'm eating pork that that Hashem wants to kill me and all these, and that I'm dishonoring my body and stuff like that. Like, I don't believe in like a lot of the tenets, and I don't follow a lot of them anymore. Though a lot of like the cultural aspects I still follow, just because like it's what I know and it's comforting and all that kind of stuff. Like, I still celebrate a lot of holidays, and I still try to keep the Sabbath as much as I can, just because it's out of habit.
Yeah. But religiously, you're more secular, you would say?
Yeah. I would actually say cult. Like, yeah, I'm definitely very secular. If I have a religion, it's history. So,
That's a cool
um,
answer, yeah. Like to
bit of a nerdy
be
one.
to be so entwined with actually learning about human history and being able to, as we've seen you do on the stream, identify with so many different time periods and cultures. Like, I'm sure that does affect you, like we talked about with philosophy earlier.
I think also like it's very hard to study history and be very intensely religious. Um, I mean, many people manage it. Don't get me wrong, and I don't, and I don't look down at people who are religious at all. It's probably the opposite. But it's like in Judaism, you're taught that you're like, as the Jewish people, you're the chosen ones, right? What that means, being chosen, is very different than what people assume. But it's mostly that you have extra responsibilities. It's kind of like you're like I don't know. I'm trying to think of like a term that would apply in the United States. But you're like the head boy or something. Oh no, that's actually
Yeah.
worse. You're just like, you just have extra rules.
Yeah.
And so you have extra responsibilities, and it kind of sucks. That's why we're never trying to encourage other people to become Jewish, because it's like, you don't want it. And Judaism is one of the only religions that believes everyone else is still going to heaven. You don't need to believe in Judaism to go to heaven.
Huh.
In fact, it might be even harder to go to heaven as a Jewish person. So, but at the same time, it's really, I also like, when you learn about so many of the other cultures, especially the other Semite cultures from the Canaanites, because the Jewish culture came out of the Hebrews, that came out of the it was a monotheistic group from the Canaanites. So when you see like how common and how many groups had different, very similar ideas about themselves and stuff, it's like it's hard for me to just assume that mine just happens the one I was born with just happens to be the correct one, you know. So it's like, you almost, it humbles you a bit, just seeing how big and vast the world is. Like that's, I guess that's probably why I'm not religious.
Ginge says Jewish people seem to be chosen for a specific purpose as opposed to being greater than. Would you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, it's to keep the Torah, which is like
Oh,
the Old
okay.
Testament, and to follow what we call the mitzvot, which are like the good deeds, 513, something like that. Yeah. Which actually most of them can't even be done by women, so it's not like I'm that useful anyways.
We'll take a couple more questions. One of them is Hypertroller. Can you ask Eris what her opinions on Aleister Crowley are?
I have no opinion.
No
613
opinion.
there.
613 commandments. Oh, okay. Yes, Oleg, thank you. Have you ever went and tried Catholicism? Says Kenny.
Okay, so funny that you asked that, because I always say if I were Christian, I would either be an Anglican or a Catholic. I'd probably be a Catholic. The only even though I don't know, I don't want to piss off any Catholic viewers, because like, in a lot of shit doesn't make any sense. But I love the aesthetics,
Yeah.
and I love Latin. And the only time I've ever felt spiritual, like a spiritual feeling, was in a cathedral. That's like the only. It was a Catholic cathedral. I still remember it. Like all the. It was such a wild thing, because in Judaism, people call our synagogues temples, but they're not actually temples. A synagogue means a meeting place. They're community centers. They're Jew community centers. That's literally what they are. People meet to pray. In reality, we're not allowed to build temples, because the only temples we're allowed were on the Temple Mount and were destroyed in Israel and all that stuff. So, so synagogues are not actually holy places in Judaism. That's why they're not that pretty. I don't know if you've ever been to a synagogue. They're very like
No.
plain, and some of the modern ones are kind of cool, but they're not too crazy. And and it's not a holy experience being in one. And whereas like in a Christian cathedral, it's literally a holy place. I remember there were rumors that would be spread in Jewish school where they're like, okay, like if you walk into a church, you burst into flame because you're Jewish. Like people used to tell each other that, and I thought it for a while. And it turned out it's not true for anyone who's concerned. And I remember walking into cathedral and everyone's quiet, which was wild because in synagogues, everyone's loud talking all the time. And everyone was like quiet. There was like some holy water, and there's candles everywhere. And everyone was just silently in their own mental space dealing with whatever they came there to pray for. And like lighting, I don't know, like it was, and I remember seeing all the saints surrounding me and stuff, like having visual representations of these godlike figures, which is what saints really are. It was very moving. I found it like incredibly moving, and I gained a lot of respect for Catholicism there. Like, just it's hard not to feel spiritual in a place like that.
That's beautiful. Oh, have you ever studied a little bit of Latin? I had a couple of years of it in middle school. It
Yeah,
was
I
very
did do it.
useful.
I did it in undergrad, and I knew it very well for like 6 months, and then it just totally left my head. Though I
Yeah.
do remember the correct way to pronounce certain things. That stayed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it became like a foundation for me having it so young. Like it was, it really affected like the way I read and comprehend things, you know, and the ability to see a word that you've never seen before and know that it has Latin roots is very useful.
I really don't like that the Catholic Church doesn't seem to do um, masses in Latin anymore. Like um, I was dating a guy once who's Catholic, uh, and he had a niece that was having her commencement. I don't know, I forget what it's called. And so like, and I went there and I was so excited, you don't understand, because for me, as someone that wasn't Christian, I wasn't raised with Christianity, and I've studied so much about, like, so many of my heroes are Catholic, right?
Hmm.
And they've all gone to mass, and I read about them going to mass, and I'm like, I'm gonna get to do this thing that like my heroes have done. This is so exciting. I'm gonna get to eat the body of Christ. This is a blast, right? And
Yeah.
turns out I'm not allowed actually to do that because I'm not a Catholic. But anyways, and
Oh.
I was so excited to hear Latin mass, and I walk and just be transported to the 16th century. That's what I thought would happen. And I sit there and they just start saying things that like talking English, you know? And I was like, what the fuck is this? What's
Yeah.
happened? And it was wild to listen to for me because one of the big things about the Catholic Church was that it didn't want the Bible translated into English, and it didn't want masses in English. And Protestants in the 16th century wanted it to be in English. They wanted it to be in the daily language. And so it was like, and so I'm listening to this. I'm like, I don't understand. I thought the whole reason why they fought the Protestants were for this, and now they just give it up. What the fuck? Like, and I didn't. It was just so wild. I don't know. I don't know why they did that. That's a bad mistake.
Hmm.
Because Latin's cool as fuck, and
Absolutely,
it
yeah.
ruins the mystique. It ruins the mystique.
You guys, and oh, like, we kind of touched on your question earlier if Eris has explored any other religions that are not Abrahamic. Have you like seriously explored any with an effort of finding faith rather than
Yes,
sort of the intellectual stuff that we talked about earlier?
yes, for sure.
Mm.
When I left Orthodox Judaism, um, I actually I love the organization. You know, when people say, "Oh, like I'm spiritual, but I don't like organized religion." Like I'm the opposite.
Mm.
Like I like the organized religion aspect. I don't like the spirituality. That's the spirituality part is always the part I struggled with, and
Mm.
um, and so I ended up leaving Orthodox Judaism mostly because of how I was treated as a woman, which is a whole thing to talk about. But I won't get into that now. But afterwards, I was starved for that organized religion aspect because a lot of stuff I loved about that world. And so I remember I went on this like a tour of world religions when I was a teenager, and I went and I visited all these places. I went to a Hindu temple. I went to a mosque. I went to a Buddhist temple. I went to a Zoroastrian temple,
Hmm.
which was crazy. I don't know if you know what Zoroastrianism is, but it's actually one of the first monotheistic religions, originally from Iran. And
Okay.
um, and like, yeah, so I experienced like a lot. So I went to like a lot of these places, and I went to a bunch of different Christian places. I even went to a Scientology church, um,
Hmm.
and that was the worst one. No surprise there, because I one of the first questions I would always ask is, how was the world created? I loved listening to like how all these different religions thought the world was created, and almost every religion would tell me this epic story by someone who's very passionate about it. And I love great stories, right? Um, and so I go to, the Scientology church, and I ask them, what, like, how was the world created according to Scientology? Because it was such a mystery to me. I just know that Tom Cruise is a Scientologist. That's all. And um, and then they tell me, well, okay, first we're gonna do this weird test on you to figure out
Yeah.
like your issues with it, and it looked like something from like sci-fi 60s that I had to be hooked up to, and then and I was like, well, that didn't answer my question. How was the world created? And they're like, okay, you're gonna have to buy this book, and then you're gonna have to work up to get to all these levels, and eventually, once you're up here, you can then buy this book, which is $2,000, after spending like
Whoa.
80,000 on all these other books. And then you'll find out how the world was created. And I was like, what the fuck? This is a
Wow.
very expensive endeavor. I don't know if I want to sign up for this. So yeah, that was probably the worst experience. But there were some really great ones. Another bad experience. I didn't like the Hindu temple either.
Hmm.
That might have. I don't want it to be a gross like impression of all of Hinduism, because there's a lot of cool things about Hinduism, and maybe I just went to a really bad temple. But the one that I went to, it felt like everything felt so like you each they had different gods. Because Hinduism is somewhat polytheistic, but it all like they believe that it's all one god taking the form of many gods.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go and pray to all these individual gods, but then they had like a coin dispenser that you could like put coins in and I remember looking at that, I was like, why do people stereotype us Jews for this shit? like this feels so weird that they like literally like you have to put loonies in there to get what you need. But a lot of religions had their own versions of that. Even in the Buddhist temple, you're more likely you had to donate a certain amount to be put on this wall so that you're more likely to be reincarnated into a good thing and not something shitty like an ant.
Yeah.
And is the mosque was a really nice experience. Also very spiritual environment. I like that you took off your shoes. I thought that was really cool.
Hmm.
As a South African, that was a nice thing. And the Zoroastrian temple was wild. That was like something out of sci-fi because they worship fire. They see fire as the symbol of God of Zarathustra, and who's the god. And they asked me before I entered if I was on my period. So that was
Oh.
weird.
Yeah.
And because you're not supposed to enter if you're on your period. Um,
Mm.
yeah, so I had like a bunch of wild experiences. I think I was just shocked by like how similar so many of them were. Um, and I think I was just more interested, and I gained respect for a lot of them, but I wasn't able to just believe in one of them. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just couldn't do it.
That's one thing, reading Bhagavad Gita and learning more about Hinduism has led me to this idea that the many gods interpretation, there's specifically this, I believe, 18 name long list, and it's all these revered names of God, and you're supposed to choose one and hold it as supreme. But it's not because it's more supreme than the others. It's because you're supposed to choose one that you really identify with. And
Hmm.
then when you hold it as supreme, it becomes supreme to you. You know what I'm saying?
That reminds me of like Roman, like in Greek polytheism, that you would
Hmm.
like have a god that you personally connected to, that your family kind of worshipped and stuff, and that was somewhat of like a symbol of your values and all the things that matter to you. Like I like that. I like that a lot. Um,
Hmm.
so I still think religion has a very important place in society. Um, the I don't know how much I like the idea of a world without religion, as John Lennon once said. However, it's like personally, I found it so challenging to just believe in one specific one, and so I would say like I'm definitely an agnostic atheist, um, but but at the same time, it's like I feel like we're also seeing such huge consequences of like for the first time ever that I can think of. There's aren't there like the majority of Gen Z like non-religious,
Hmm.
and I think that and I don't think it's coincidence that everyone's so depressed. Um, there's like there's a reason why humans didn't invent religion, for the shits and giggles. Like, we did it probably because there was a need for it. So I think, and there hasn't really been something that replaced it in terms of like community and stuff that brings people together. Um, and I think that really sucks.
You guys, we're closing questions now because we've held Eris for 2.5 hours, and I want to let her go in a second. But we have two more. One I think is pretty quick. Were you ever drawn to occultism? That's a bit more individualistic than I think is your cup of tea, though.
Um, I wouldn't say like I might ruffle some feathers, but I feel like my experience in Orthodox Judaism was very cult-like,
Hmm.
um, and I was drawn to it. So I would say yes, but a lot of people would be offended by that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that there are certain sects within certain religions that can be very cult-like, um, and because in Judaism you don't have like an official head of the entire religion, you instead have like lots of these different sects of Judaism that often have like their head rabbis and stuff. You can have very insular communities where the rabbi basically just dictates everything, um, and they can be a bit cult-like.
Mm-hmm.
So
Um.
yeah, so that was definitely one of my problems with that
Mhm.
experience.
And our last question, a bit of a random one, but I think it's kind of interesting. What are your opinions on Gilgamesh? Do you enjoy that story? And do you think it holds a lot of weight in historical assessment in general?
It's such a bad last question for me because I know so little about it and I have no opinion.
Oh, that's okay.
I'm so sorry.
That is okay. Yeah, we know that Gilgamesh, influenced a lot of other stories, but at the end of the day, it's one of the more ancient things, and there's not, a ton of extraneous information that you can glean from it, I guess.
Hmm.
Hmm. That was fantastic, Eris. Thank you so much for coming on. We hit right at 2:22, and I want to give you the opportunity to say anything you would like to the audience and shout yourself out, all that good stuff. I'm sure everybody here is already following you.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, thanks so much for having me. You're an amazing interviewer. So cool to get to
Thank
actually talk
you.
about topics I find interesting, which was
Hmm.
great. Um, and yeah, I'm thinking I might come back to streaming this week. So we'll see. I said that last week and I didn't, but we'll see. I get anxious, but either way, you should follow me on Twitter. I'm Aristocracy TV there, and I have incredibly witty, smart tweets. They're always correct. They're never wrong.
Hmm.
They're never ridiculous. Um, I recently had the hot take of saying that you should be able to hit on everyone anywhere.
Hmm.
Um, and which is obviously like the best take ever, no matter what. I'm totally not being a pick me. Um, so yeah, so you should definitely follow me on Twitter.
Absolutely. I liked that tweet actually. You said that even if you were at a funeral, if the person who was the love of your life came and hit on you, you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, like I feel like I feel like everyone is just when people say that they don't want to be hit on in certain places, I think what they really mean, and maybe they're lying to themselves or lying to other people, and maybe I'm just coping, but I really feel like they're just saying they don't want to be hit on by someone that they don't find attractive, that they don't
Ah.
want to hit on them. Um, And or maybe someone's in a relationship and they're not interested, but at the end of the day, it's like the guy of your dreams, the person of your dreams hits on you, even if you are in the most compromising, weird situation. Would you really want that person not to be able to hit on you, like, and lose that opportunity? I know, I don't know. I feel like we're putting so many rules on everyone, that it's at the end of the day, like, it's gonna be scary getting hit on everywhere. For me, it's always a panicky situation, even if I'm in a place where I so-called signed up for it, like a club or something like that. So it's always going to be somewhat stressful. It's not going to be like more stressful or less like at a place like the gym. And I also feel like there's something that's less romantic and so plain about the fact that you have to, like, you're only ever going to you're never going to let like chance happen, that you always have to sign up for a place for where you're going to get hit on. So it feels like you're only in the future, everyone's only going to be able to meet people on online dating apps, and that's just toxic to me.
Yeah.
I hate those. So
absolutely.
yeah, let chance happen. Exactly.
Let chance happen and let people interact in real life in a way that's genuine. I feel like so many people, just sort of circling back around to the anonymous topic, like so many people find now that they can only be genuine when they're not actually presenting themselves.
I would just, like, for me, I would so much rather focus my energies on teaching men rather than like where to hit on women, and instead teach them how to, like, and how not to, like the teaching them not to be entitled, to take rejection positively, encourage women to be able to hit on men themselves, and that kind of thing. Like, to me, like, that should be the focus, because at the end of the day, if someone does it in a nice way, even if it's an awkward place like a funeral, there's a lot of good romance movies that started that way. Okay,
Yeah.
so I don't know.
One thing I do is I definitely don't hit on people immediately because I don't know if I'll be attracted to them. I often, before I was
I'm the
no
exact
longer
same way.
single.
Yeah.
Yeah, before I was no longer single, like, I would talk to someone and then I would decide, oh, I'm attracted to this person. Now I'm hitting on you. Now this is happening, you know?
Yeah, it's almost like when I used to be in the city, I would get hit on a lot on the subway. That was like a very common area. And there was always, like, if a guy hit on me that was unattractive, like, that was shitty. But if a guy that was attractive hit on me, then I'd be fully panic attacking, because I didn't sign up for this, I didn't expect this, and I'm like stressing out. But at the same time, it's like, what if you meet someone really cool that way? Like, sometimes being stressed out, a scary, weird situation isn't always a bad thing, sometimes, magic still needs to be able to happen. And yeah, too many rules feels like, especially you turn dating into like an industrial thing, which is what dating apps are. And it's like the majority of men are now meeting women on dating apps. Like, that's crazy. That seems, but I'm not allowed to talk about my dating takes, because apparently, according to my friends, my dating takes are like the dumbest things ever. Like, that's what they all say,
Oh no.
Destiny also agreed, so I'm not supposed to talk about it. I don't know.
Oh well. Well, thank you so much, Eris. This has been absolutely lovely. We would love to have you on again at some point. And everybody go follow Aristocracy TV, you guys.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Johnny.
All right, friend. We will see you later. All right. Thank you all for being here for this. That was fantastic, both of you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Big thank you to Eris, and we will see you tomorrow. Mwah! I'll see you later. Bye.